The Speaker of the House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi, has a reputation of being an expert stock picker. Pelosi has a commanding position in the US government, giving her access to information that the average trader on Wall Street doesn't. This has led to commentators accusing her of using her information asymmetry to her advantage in trading on that information, hiding behind her parliamentary privilege to avoid scrutiny for insider trading. Here in New Zealand, at any one point in time, we have around 120 people in our House of Representatives. At the end of January each year, each Member of Parliament must disclose certain information relating to their assets and gifts to ensure that we don't have a similar situation as that in the United States. The information is pretty high level, but there are many interesting insights I've found by digging around in the data. In this video, I'll be sharing my insights in 3 parts. Firstly, what Kiwisaver providers are popular with our MPs? Secondly, what banks are common with our MPs for their banking needs, such as mortgages? And thirdly, what private investments are popular with our MPs? If you like this video, please make sure to subscribe to my channel down below to see more content just like this in the personal finance and investing space. Let's get into it. Let's start by determining which Kiwisaver provider is the most popular, which will help us determine the characteristics of the average Kiwisaver member. By creating a profile of the average, we'll be able to easily determine whether our lawmakers are consciously choosing their Kiwisaver funds over and above the average person on the street. In March of this year, ratings agency Canstar collated a list of all the member data to determine who the fund manager was with the most members. When we look at the 10 most popular funds, 9 of these are managed by one of the 3 largest banks in New Zealand, ANZ, ASB and Westpac. This suggests that Kiwis may prefer to have their funds with large household banking names that they know and trust. Alternatively, it may also suggest that Kiwis prefer to have all their financial products with one provider, as these 3 banks are by far the largest in providing other financial products such as mortgages and personal loans. It is also interesting to note that these funds are a diverse mix of conservative, balanced and growth funds, suggesting the average Kiwi is consciously choosing a fund and not just sitting around in one of the low-growth default ones. Hidden amongst the data is the lone non-bank Kiwisaver provider, Fisher Funds, who have over 100,000 members sitting in their growth fund, and according to their website, over 200,000 members in total. Having acquired Aon's 21,000 Kiwisaver members last year, and been in the New Zealand market for over 20 years, Fisher Funds have built a solid reputation to compete with the large banks. So to build the average profile of a Kiwisaver member, they stick to the large Australian banking brands. They probably stick with their existing financial service provider for convenience, and they don't appear to actively shop around for new providers. Let's see if our politicians are the same. The document that outlines these details is called the Register of Pecuniary and Other Specified Interests, and as mentioned is updated once annually as at the end of January. It lists all of the gifts, all of the investments, trusts and special interests our politicians have. In theory, it's their conflicts of interest, or areas where they may benefit through their lawmaking. Let's not forget, Kiwisaver is a voluntary superannuation scheme and is frequently preached to the average Kiwi by the lawmakers. So how many of them are actually in Kiwisaver? Among our 120 members of Parliament, 110 of them are listed in the register as members. This leaves 10 who are not in a Kiwisaver fund, suggesting they may not see the appeal of it or prefer the flexibility of managing their own superannuation outside of Kiwisaver. Unlike what we saw in the Canstar data for the average New Zealander, our 110 politicians in Kiwisaver have invested with 19 Kiwisaver providers in total. This is surprisingly high, suggesting that politicians are more selective with their provider than the average New Zealander. The surprises don't end there, with the most popular providers among MPs being very different from those for the average Kiwi. Here is a list of the top 10 providers according to the latest disclosures. As you can see, AMP is by far the most popular provider, with local fund managers such as Booster, Kiwi Wealth and Simplicity closely trailing. There may be a few reasons why our politicians have opted for these fund managers and actively moved away from the larger Aussie bank funds. Firstly, Booster, Kiwi Wealth and Simplicity are all either Kiwi owned and operated or have a large ownership by New Zealand. Kiwi Wealth is effectively owned by the New Zealand government, Booster is Kiwi owned and operated, and Simplicity is owned by a New Zealand charitable trust. Secondly, the providers each have funds listed on their Mindful Money website for their focus on investing in ethical industries with consideration towards ESG factors. This also appears on their websites as a focus. Thirdly, Simplicity is known in the industry for having lower fees than average. And fourthly, the fees collected by Simplicity and Kiwi Wealth are largely reinvested back into the community through charitable donations in the case of Simplicity and into the government's bank account through Kiwi Wealth. So in essence, as compared to the average Kiwisaver member on the street, our politicians are consciously choosing fund providers that redirect fund revenue into the communities, invest in ethical sectors, are largely local, and have lower than average fees. As we move down the list, you can now start to see more familiar names such as ASB, ANZ, Westpac, and Fisher funds, which as we discussed earlier are the most common selections across all Kiwisaver members. A further 11 funds have 5 or less MPs invested, including BNZ, Superlife, Milford, Mercer, and Mass. Now if we instead look at the data by political party, you can see there are no real trends. The only exception to this are the Green Party, as their 7 members are all invested in just 3 fund providers, namely AMP, Kiwi Wealth, and Simplicity. In other words, it looks like they're sticking with ethical fund providers and are consciously choosing who to give their funds to. So, it is clear that our politicians invest in Kiwisaver slightly differently to the average person, who largely invests with the mainstream Aussie banks. Let's now look to see if there are any trends in the banking relationships our MPs have. In the same register as the Kiwisaver information, the MPs must also disclose the debts they have and who they're with. In this analysis, I assume that if an MP had a mortgage with a bank, this would be deemed as their closest banking relationship. In some cases this was difficult, particularly for some of the richer MPs, but drew the line where it appeared to be the most strong. Of the 120 MPs, 36 did not disclose as having a mortgage. Lucky them. The others did, so let's take a look at the findings. With 22 MPs having a mortgage with ANZ, they stand as the most common bank for MPs. Despite the former leader of National, John Key, now being the chairman of ANZ New Zealand, the bank doesn't appear as popular with the party, as their members prefer to bank with ASB and BNZ, the second and third most common banking relationship. Westpac sneaks into 4th place, with Kiwi Bank coming in at 5th. Overall, this isn't dissimilar with the mortgage market for the wider public. ANZ has an approximately 30% share of the mortgage market in New Zealand. Aussie banks in total control 85% of the market, and the New Zealand banks such as Kiwi Bank, TSB and SBS have just a 9% share. So we can't draw any interesting conclusions here, unfortunately. The third segment of this video is to look at the miscellaneous investments our MPs hold. It is clear from the disclosures that certain MPs appear to be busy on their Sharesies app. One MP disclosed as many as 26 investments, probably not too dissimilar to some of us in Sharesies. There is a good mix in the data between ETFs such as Smartshares and in individual companies. Let's start with the companies. The most common industry by far were in the energy sector, specifically Genesis with 4 MPs owning stock. Closely trailing this was Mercury and Trustpower. Other popular names included Air New Zealand, Fisher & Paykel Healthcare, Heartland Bank, Bliss, Fonterra, A2 Milk, Skellerup, Rocket Lab, and the retirement housing providers Ryman and Oceania. One MP even owns shares in the New Zealand weed company Cannasouth, and they aren't even in the Green Party. Tesla, of course, is another common pick, a bit of Berkshire as well, and in the case of Chris Bishop, he even owns stock in Parrot Dog Breweries. Nice! Moving over to the funds, the Smartshares family of ETFs appear to be very popular among MPs, along with the Pi funds and ethical fund manager Pathfinder. As always, don't take your local Member of Parliament's personal investments as a recommendation. If you followed everything they did with their finances, you'd be bankrupted before you even knew it. I hope you enjoyed this video and learned more about the investment decisions of our Members of Parliament here in New Zealand. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure to give the video a like down below and consider subscribing to the channel to see more content just like this in the personal finance and investing space. Thanks for watching, and I look forward to catching you on the next one. Cheers.